Nehemiah is an incredible book. It's probably one of my favorite in the Old Testament. The story is an interesting story. It's just a neat story to read and to study. The lessons that are found within it are, even though these are events that took place a long time ago in a place far away from here, there are lessons that I think are very contemporary, very helpful for us today, and we'll hopefully see a few of those. And so I hope that this study is helpful and encouraging as we go through the book of Nehemiah. Like with the other books that we've gone through, we're not going to get down into a lot of the details of this book because we're going to try and cover the whole book in one lesson. And so it is going to be an overview. We'll go through some of the context here in just a moment, and then we will go through kind of chapter by chapter what each chapter is about, and then we'll end by looking at a few of the themes that are found throughout the book of Nehemiah. So there are many, many more things. There's other lessons that could be preached, other studies that could be done, but we'll hopefully just overview the book of Nehemiah and have a good understanding of it from our study together. So a few things, and we went over a lot of this in the book of Ezra as well, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on all of this background, but just as a reminder, and I just mentioned this, we're at the end of the eras of the Old Testament. You can divide up the eras of the Old Testament, these creation and patriarch and Exodus and so on, and all of the books of the Old Testament fit somewhere in one of these eras. Now, I don't have the books of poetry and prophecy up here, but they all fit somewhere in this spectrum as well. But historically, you go from Genesis all the way through, and we also haven't covered 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but we'll, Lord willing, do that later down the road. But we're down here in the return era. So after the monarchy period, of course, there was the exile period where Judah was captivated by Babylon, and they spent 70 years in captivity. And then there are 3 books that take place during that return period where Israel or Judah begins returning from Babylon back to Jerusalem and Judah. And those books are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And so we're right there at the end of the Old Testament history as far as the eras are concerned. Again, we went over this last time, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but when you're reading through these last 3 books of the Old Testament, as far as the history goes of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, there's a lot of historical things that are taking place, and it can kind of help because you have all these different kings that are mentioned and leaders that are mentioned. And so if you're interested, I can get this information to you. But these are the kings that we really deal with as far as the Persian kings after the fall of Babylon. Cyrus is the one who conquers Babylon, and the Medo-Persian Empire becomes the world empire at that point. Cyrus is the one who issues the decree to allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem. That happens around 559, 558 BC. There's a couple of short reigns in there that these individuals aren't recorded in the Bible. But then we have Darius, who reinstates the decree to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. We read about that in Ezra. Then you have Ahasuerus or Xerxes. This is perhaps one of the most famous of the Persian kings, just secularly, but he also is the one who married Esther, and so we read about him in that book. And then there is Artaxerxes the first, who is the king who reigns during the lives of Ezra and Nehemiah. He's the king who sends Ezra back, and then we'll send a return wave with Nehemiah as well. Then there's also the Jewish leaders, and there's a bunch of names between Ezra and Nehemiah, and some of these have passed on by the time we get to Nehemiah, but Zerubbabel and Jeshua and Haggai and Zechariah, they were all involved in that first wave of individuals that went back the first time that Cyrus decreed that the Jews could begin going back to Jerusalem. And then there's quite a bit of time that takes place between that first return and the life of Ezra, when we're the latter part of Ezra's book that records him going back and reestablishing proper worship and living conditions that had deteriorated there. And then the third and final wave of return is by Nehemiah. And he is going to return to Jerusalem, and there's going to be more restoration than just the physical building. But the primary focus of the book is the rebuilding of the wall around Jerusalem. The wall, of course, had been destroyed with the city. The walls and the gates were in disrepair. That left the city open to attack and to just shame. It was shameful to see the capital city of Judah to be in such devastation. And so Nehemiah leads this third wave of returnees to the land, and that's his focus, is rebuilding the city wall. And during this time is probably when Malachi is a prophet. If you read Malachi, that is the last book of the Old Testament in our English ordered Bibles. He is a prophet during this time, during the lives of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so what has happened here, just the historical background that has led us up to this. Of course, you've got Nebuchadnezzar that had taken the first wave of exiles, and then there were two more waves. You have Cyrus and Persia overcoming, as we've already mentioned, and we've mentioned most of this. But after Zerubbabel leads that first wave, we have the foundation of the temple is laid. There's a little bit of a delay, and then the temple is finally finished. Several years later, Ezra leads the second return to Jerusalem, and then we pick up about 13 years after this is when we get to the book of Nehemiah. So from Ezra's return to Nehemiah, we've got a little over a decade of time that has passed. So the book itself, just kind of an outline to help us picture all of the book together. Like a lot of these books, you can divide into two main sections. The first 6 chapters focus on rebuilding the wall. And so the first couple chapters tell us about how Nehemiah finds out about the problem, how he talks with the king, how the king allows him to go back. And then chapters 3 through 6 all focus on the rebuilding of the wall. There's chapter 5 has kind of a side story in there, but that's the main focus, is rebuilding the wall. Now, you'll notice that's kind of the primary focus of the book, and yet it's only about half of the book. Chapters 7 through 13 continue the story of restoration, but it's not just about the wall. The wall has been completed, which with the wall complete, we've now have the temple has been rebuilt, the city walls have been rebuilt, and so Jerusalem is again a legitimate city. It's a legitimate home for God's people, a legitimate capital. But that's the physical things are not all that matters. And so there's the restoration of the people. And there's some things that need to take place. There's a renewal of the covenant, and there's obedience and disobedience that's discussed in the final several chapters of the book of Nehemiah. And so now we'll just go through and we'll just kind of go chapter by chapter, and we'll just have brief descriptions of the chapters and what's taking place here. In Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah learns he is living in Babylon at the time. He is a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. And so he is living, he's not back in Judah, he's not in Jerusalem, he is living still in the area of the captives. Now, like some of the others of his predecessors, some of his forerunners like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, other men that we read about in the Old Testament who lived during this time period, he apparently was well known and he had been given a very prominent position. The cupbearer was one of the most trusted, or was supposed to be one of the most trusted individuals by the king. And so this is a very prominent position for Nehemiah to have. Now, we open up and somebody, a relative or a friend, has visited from Jerusalem, and Nehemiah asks how things are going, and the man tells him the people are in trouble. It's, in fact, in verses 1 through 3, it says that the exiles live in great trouble and shame because the walls are still destroyed, the gates are still destroyed, and in ancient times, that basically meant it wasn't a city. Because back then, how do you protect against invasions? How do you protect your citizenry? Well, you have a wall, and hopefully you've got a big wall and a thick wall and a well-armed wall. And so for this to be the capital of God's people, and there's no gates, there's no walls, it's a disgrace. In fact, that's what that idea of it's a great trouble and shame. Why were they so ashamed of that? Because it showed that they still weren't strong. These were supposed to be God's people, and their city is in ruins. They don't have any protection. And when Nehemiah hears this, in verses 4 through 11, we read about his response. And what he does is he of course, weeps, he mourns, he begins to fast, and he prays. And verses 5 through 11 are the first of many prayers that we read about from Nehemiah in this book. I think this may be the longest one of Nehemiah's that we read about. But this, by the way, is one of those, we're not going to study Nehemiah's prayer tonight because we're doing an overview. But if you want to study something extra from the book of Nehemiah, study chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. It's a beautiful prayer, a powerful prayer. It's a great study on prayer. And so Nehemiah prays fervently to God about this situation. His heart's broken when he hears about the fact that things are not good for his brethren back home. And so he begins to pray to God about this. Now in chapter 2, the end of chapter 1 tells us that he was the cupbearer to the king, and we're brought into, he tells us the month and the day, and he is before King Artaxerxes, and he's the cupbearer, so he's attending to the king. But King Artaxerxes can tell that something's wrong with Nehemiah. He can tell that he's upset, that he's sad, that he's depressed. And so he asks Nehemiah what's going on. He can tell that this is an issue of the heart, that there's a sadness here. And we may read that and think, well, this is a really nice guy, this Artaxerxes. He cares about his cupbearer, and he's asking how he's feeling. And this is a dangerous situation. You don't attend to the king of the world with a gloomy face. If Artaxerxes is mad that this man is acting pouty in his presence, Artaxerxes can kill this man if he wants to. And so this is a dangerous situation. Now, Artaxerxes very well may have cared for him, but it's much like Esther when she was supposed to go before Xerxes, and she had told Mordecai, her cousin, if I go before him, and she's his wife, if I approach him without being summoned, he can execute me. That's the kings of Persia. And so here's Nehemiah, who I don't think he's just throwing a little tantrum. He can't help but be sad about his people, but that could upset the king. And so, interestingly, we read just a very short phrase. I think it's there, verse 4, when Nehemiah starts to tell him why he's upset. And the king says, what are you requesting? And it just says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. And then he starts talking. And so that must have been a very short prayer. I don't think he made King Artaxerxes wait for a while. Well, he went off to his private room and prayed. But we're all probably familiar with these types of prayer. He says a very quick but very fervent prayer as he gets ready to speak to King Artaxerxes. And don't underestimate it. His life is maybe on the line in his mind. So he gives his plea, though. He explains to Artaxerxes what has happened to his people. And now Artaxerxes probably is a bit more understanding than we might think, because remember, who is his mother? It's very likely Esther. And so he may have some compassion, or he's at least familiar with the queen mother if she wasn't his biological mother. So maybe he has some compassion for these people. But whatever the reasoning is, King Artaxerxes hears the plea and he agrees with Nehemiah. And even though this is to the king of the world, a small place, a long ways away, that he really probably shouldn't have to be worried about, he wants Nehemiah to go help these people. And so he sends Nehemiah back to the people. Now, of course, we're told why this happened. At the end of verse 8, it says, for the good hand of my God was upon me. And so God is at work in this situation. But Artaxerxes sends Nehemiah back. And so Nehemiah gets back to Jerusalem, and we're told there that he begins to inspect the damage. And he kind of does this maybe a strange way. Perhaps he knows the trouble that's going to come up. Maybe he knows the enemies that are around. But when he gets to Jerusalem, he has just a small group of people go with him, and they go out at night. And they go all around the city, and they go looking at all of the gates and the walls and assessing all of the damage. So they don't do this in broad daylight. They don't do this. Nobody knows, it says, that Nehemiah is doing this. But he goes and he inspects the walls and the gates with just a few people. And then the next day he comes to the Jewish people. He comes to the leaders and he exhorts them. He tells them what he has seen and that he has been sent back. And he basically challenges them. He says, we need to rebuild these walls. We need to rebuild these gates. We need to refortify this city. And these people, instead of getting upset that this newcomer is coming back and telling them to get to work or rebuking them for letting the city be in such disrepair, they agree. And they set their mind to do the work that Nehemiah has called them to do. And so that gets ready to begin. And chapter 3, we're going to come back to chapter 3 in the themes. It's a really interesting chapter, even though if you read through it, it reads like one of those boring chapters that just has a lot of names and places. But we'll talk about it in a bit because it details the groups of people and the work that they did they're rebuilding the wall. But in chapter 4, we find the problem. We find the villains of the story. There are some individuals. One is named Sanballat, and the other is named Tobiah. And there's a couple of other men that are named throughout the story, but Sanballat and Tobiah seem to be the ones that are named every time. They are angry. Now, they are some leaders in the area, and they are angry that Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt. They don't want Jerusalem to become the city that it once was. They don't want the Jewish people to thrive. They don't want them to succeed. And so they grow very angry, and they start trying to do everything that they can to frustrate the work. And we'll talk about some of the things that they did, because the stories of persecution in this story are helpful, I think, even for us today. When you see how these people acted, and think about how people sometimes act towards us, but they mocked the people, they derided the work of the people, they tried to discourage them, they even planned an attack that was never able to come to fruition. They try to entrap Nehemiah. And so there's all these things taking place that could have been very discouraging for the work, and yet the work continues. And in an amazing way, and this is where a lot of the lessons come from, so it's probably the part you're familiar with, so we're not going to talk a lot about it, but what Nehemiah does is he sets some of the people, and he says, you're going to protect the workers. And so you've got people that spend their time working, and you've got their friends behind them who are holding their spears and their swords, and they're ready for the attack. And as people eat, they all stay in the city, so they don't go out. They all stay in together for protection. And we're told that even when they were eating and sleeping, the sword was at their right side. And so it's an incredible story of preparation. They were always prepared. They didn't let the work go to the wayside because of a threat. They just prepared to meet the threat. They worked together. It's a beautiful story of workmanship and teamwork as these people worked together, cared for each other, protected one another, and so the work continues to go on. Now, in the midst of that beautiful story of teamwork and all things going well, we have chapter 5, which is kind of a side story from the wall, but Nehemiah finds something out here that's taking place that needs to be corrected. Because, yes, he's getting them to start working together, but there's some problems within the community. And that is that many of the rulers and the nobles have been exploiting the poor of the people. But the big problem in chapter 5 is they have been lending money to their needy brethren, and they've been doing so exacting interest, which in the law of Moses was against the law for an Israelite to loan money or to make any type of loan to his brother and charge interest for that. Now, they could do that to foreigners, but they were not supposed to do that with their brethren. But they had been doing that. They probably learned this practice from foreigners and from being in captivity and learning from the lands around them. And so what they were doing is their needy brethren were borrowing, and they were able to charge whatever they wanted to exact this interest. And the poor people began having to mortgage their vineyards and their properties that is theirs by right. It's supposed to be their inheritance, remember? And they're having to mortgage everything to the hilt to try and pay their lords and their nobles. And it's a situation where they can never get out of their poverty, and it just keeps helping the lords get rich. And when Nehemiah finds out about this, he grows very angry, and he rebukes the nobles, and he rebukes the leaders. And this is one of those great examples again. What do you think happens when the rich people get told that they're exploiting the poor and they need to give up their wealth and give back? Well, in most stories, the nobles get mad and they try and find a way to get back at the leader. In this story, they listen. And they repent, and they give the land back, and they stop making these loans with interest to their brethren, and they help their brethren out. A lot of times the rich become the villain, and they had been acting villainous. But even they can be turned to truth. And these people were. And so a big problem has a great end, a great ending result. And so Nehemiah deals with that problem. And then in chapter 6, we read about the finishing of the wall. Now, Sanballat and Tobiah, they try a few more ways to harm Nehemiah or his reputation. But despite all of the challenges and all the threats, the people keep working. And the wall is built in 52 days. Now, that's amazing to me. Maybe that sounds like a long time to you to build a wall, but this is around the entire city of Jerusalem. In 52 days, it didn't even take them a full 2 months. It is absolutely amazing what can be accomplished when people work together, especially when people work together to do God's will. When we aren't worried about, well, that's not my job, that's your job. When we're not worried about, well, that's beneath me, I'm too big for that or too smart for that or whatever it may be. When we're just worried about doing whatever work we can and helping our brothers and our sisters as they do their work, it is amazing what God's people can accomplish. And I think that's true even today. We aren't building physical walls or physical buildings, but what great work can we do for the kingdom if we will work together? So then we get to the second half of the book, the renewal and restoration. And so chapter 7 is a genealogical chapter. They find the original records of the people that had returned. And those are important numbers, especially for them as they're figuring out families and the priesthood. And then chapter 8, they have a reading of the law. And Ezra shows up in the book of Nehemiah. Ezra, who was a priest, is charged with reading the law to the people. And chapters 8 and on aren't typically people's most favorite chapters. They're not quite as exciting as about reading, the drama of these people trying to build a wall and having to have a sword at their side while they're building. They've got a trowel in one hand and a sword in another. And that's kind of exciting stuff. But these latter chapters are very important chapters because they really show the renewal and the revival of these people. And it's also amazing how much the Word of God is at the center. These people come together, and Ezra gets up, and then there's some other priests that help Ezra, and they begin teaching the people. They begin reading the law of the people. In fact, verses 7 and 8 of chapter 8 say they helped the people to understand the law. They read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. Now that the city walls were built, the temple's been erected, the city walls are built, but now it's time to keep going with the spiritual work. And so Ezra and the priests begin building up the people with the knowledge of God's law. And we may think that these people know everything about the law. These are Jewish people, right? Well, they've had centuries of rebellion. They've had a long time in captivity away from Jerusalem, and the time that they've had, decades now, in Jerusalem has certainly not been ideal. And so, no, these people do not know the law the way that they should have. In fact, during this chapter, as they're reading the law, they read about the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, that was discussed in the law of Moses. That was a feast that was to commemorate the time that their ancestors dwelt in tents in the wilderness. And so they were to live in tents in the city of Jerusalem for that week and celebrate God's protection during that time. They didn't know about that feast. But when they are reading it, and they look at their calendars and they realize what time it is, it's actually time for the Feast of Tabernacles. Do you know what they do? They all go out and they get tents in their nice new city that has its walls. They go out and they sleep in tents in this city and they observe the Feast of Tabernacles. It's an incredible lesson of people that were ready and willing to learn. And when God's law showed them they weren't doing something they were supposed to do, they got busy doing it. And later on, when God's law shows them that they're doing things they shouldn't be doing, they stop doing it. The word is so important in the book of Nehemiah. And chapter 8 really shows us that reading. Then chapter 9, the people, as they are engaged in all this activity, they come together and they have a time of confession, and basically public confession and public prayer. And this must have been an incredible day. We talk about meetings. We enjoy gospel meetings, or sometimes we hear some of the people talk about meetings of times gone by, and they say, oh, we used to have 10-day meetings, and we used to have meetings that went on for a month, and people would come every night. Well, verse 3, this is talking, this just keeps going. It says, they stood up in their place and read from the book of the law of the Lord for their God for a quarter of the day. For another quarter of it, they made confession and worshiped the Lord their God. Now, at shortest, let's say they divide the day up into two, the morning and the evening. So if you only go with half a day in 12 hours, these people sat and listened or stood and listened to Ezra and the other priests read the law for at least 3 hours. And then they collectively confessed their faults as a nation and prayed to God and worshiped him for another 3 hours. Now, that's if you take the shortened day. If you take that literally as the full day, double those numbers. These people spent a lot of time in worship, and they've already been reading from the law. They've already been celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. But these people, this is a beautiful picture of real revival. I know that gets talked about sometimes in the world around us, but this is a picture of real revival that's taking place amongst the people of Israel at this time. And also, if you want to learn about confession, go read Nehemiah chapter 9. The people did not get together, and I'm not mocking us or anybody. I know sometimes this is the simplest way to pray, especially publicly, but they didn't pray, we've said and thought and done some things. They spend a long time being very honest about their history as a people and all of their failures towards God. And it is an open-hearted and humbling confession that these people make. I think that's a good lesson for us to learn. It's not appropriate for us in a public prayer to confess everybody's private faults, everything we could count up. But especially as we pray to God, I think there are times that we need to do much more than just say, God, if I've done something, please forgive me for it. We know there are things sometimes that we know are wrong, attitudes that we know we are struggling with, things we've said or done, and we don't just cover it up. There are times that it's good for us to go and truly confess and pour those things out to God and acknowledge our failures so that we can renew our commitment to him. And that's where this all leads. This wasn't just a let's beat ourselves up and feel good about it. This is how they recommit to the covenant. And they acknowledge it's not an easy thing. In fact, all the way back, you go all the way back in their prayer and their public speaking goes all the way back to the wilderness. And they don't have a great track record. They rebelled then. They rebelled after that. They kept rebelling. Yeah, there were sprinkled some good times and good kings and so on. But they kept rebelling. And then they were in captivity. And many of them continued to rebel. And then they were brought back to the land. And there was still rebellion. And they confess that and acknowledge that. But they commit to doing their best. And even they are going to have problems. But they recommit to the covenant in chapter 10. And then chapters 11 through 13 go through some of the final restoration and reforms. Chapter 11 talks about resettling the land. Now, this is kind of a sad chapter in my mind. It has some hope, but these people want to go to their areas and allotments. But Jerusalem, they've got this big, nice city now. They've got these walls, but the city's empty. And so they need a population in the capital city. And so they come up with a plan. They all draw lots. And essentially 1 out of every 10 people is going to have to stay in the city of Jerusalem and live there. And the rest of the people will go out to all of the villages and towns in the surrounding countryside. And I want you to think about that. In my reading plan, I just read through the allotment of the land in Joshua the other day. An allotment of the entire land of Canaan, from the Mediterranean Sea to east of the Jordan River, north to south. Allotment for millions and millions of people. And now they are so reduced. They're having to draw lots so that their capital city even has a population. How demoralizing would that be? How sad is that? That's what their centuries of rebellion and stiff-necked stubbornness had got them. The nation of millions had been reduced to this. It's also amazing, though, to think about that even in this disparaging moment, God's plan's still working. Even from the rubble that remains, God's plans are not thwarted. He's still working, even with this remnant, just like He promised. Chapter 12 is a celebration of the dedication of the wall. And it's a time of joy. It lists the priests and the Levites. That's important because things are getting back on track for worship and for life amongst Jewish people. And there's a joyous celebration as they complete the wall. Verse 43, for kind of the sad setting of chapter 11, verse 43 of chapter 12 is a beautiful note. It says, they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. And the women and children rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. So that's a beautiful counterbalance to chapter 11. They could have been very demoralized and sad that this is where we're at. We're drawing lots just to have people live here. But they were back home. God had fulfilled His promises so far. And that was a reason to rejoice. In fact, so much so that, small as they were able to make a great noise that was heard far away. Well, chapter 13, I don't know exactly how much time has passed, but at some point, Nehemiah, who is also serving as governor of Judah, has to go back to Babylon for a while. And so he leaves and he goes back to Babylon, and then he returns. And when he gets back, some things have gone wrong. There's some problems that need to be addressed. Particularly, they needed to separate some of the foreigners among them. They had Ammonites and Moabites that apparently were coming into the temple precincts, and God's law had said they should not. There were portions that were meant for the Levites that were not being given to the Levites. Some of the tithes and offerings were not being distributed to the Levites. There were Sabbath violations, people working and buying and selling on the Sabbath. And then there were the problem of foreign marriages. And so all of these get addressed. And it's one of those, it's amazing. Nehemiah doesn't hold back. Nehemiah goes right after the people and the guilty parties and rebukes them, and they change. Now, he also apparently had some help. Malachi, you read the book of Malachi, he tackles all of those same problems. Those are the things that are the focus of Malachi's works of prophecy. But that chapter 13 finishes up the book of Nehemiah. Now, a few things to talk about in this book, just a few themes, and then we'll end up. And we've already mentioned this briefly, but the idea of working together. And especially in chapter 3. I know a lot of focus gets put on that chapter of men, holding a spear or a sword while their brethren worked and having a sword at their side. That's kind of neat. Chapter 3 gets overlooked because it's a boring chapter, because it's just a list of names. I won't read it, but you can go read it. You can see all those difficult names and names of the places and gates that mean nothing to us. That they were repairing. So it's easy to kind of skip over that chapter. But as I was looking at it, there's a few things that really stood out to me. First of all, the types of people that were mentioned. Now, who do you employ to build the city wall? Well, when you're Judah, returned from captivity and struggling, you put everybody to work doing it. And it doesn't matter your status. It doesn't matter how much money you have or don't have. It doesn't matter what your day job is. You help the cause. We're told about the high priest and his brethren. We're told about other priests and Levites and temple servants. They had important jobs to be doing as priests and temple servants. And they went and they helped build the wall. We read about several of the merchants. We're told about goldsmiths. We're told about other merchants. We're told about perfumers. Someone whose job, now I don't think perfumers were probably the exact same as today, but when you think of who's most qualified to build a wall, you don't think of people in the perfume industry. But these people helped. The goldsmiths helped. The merchants, instead of selling their wares, they go and they help build the wall. The rulers helped. In fact, 7 or 8 times we're told about people, and this probably means not just them, but maybe the group that they were over, but these rulers got involved, rulers of districts, rulers of Mizpah, rulers of half of Jerusalem, of half of the district of Jerusalem. We're told about one man in verse 12, it says, Shallum, he was the ruler of half the district of Jerusalem, with his daughters, went and worked on the wall. He got his daughters out, and they went and they worked on the wall. The picture is everybody was working. And they were working together. It didn't matter. There's one group that's mentioned. Negatively, it says that some of the lords of one of the groups would not stoop to do this type of work. How'd you like to be the one person that's named you wouldn't stoop to help build up the city of God? But everybody else, they pitched in and they worked together. And with that, they accomplished amazing things. There's one group that's told on verse 13, there's a man named Hanan, and the inhabitants of Zanoah were told that they repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall. Now, we don't measure things in cubits, but a cubit is 18 inches. So that's a foot and a half. These people repaired, this one group repaired 1,500 feet of a city wall. That's 5 football fields. If you've ever built a fence, you know that putting up fencing and walls is not easy. And they weren't putting up a fence, they were putting up city walls. And just this one group did 1,500 feet of it. Now, some of the people were told they worked on the part that was across from their house or by their house. They did what they could. But when you read through chapter 3, you see a picture of unity, of pitching in, of doing what you can. And that's what leads to the later chapters that says they got it done in 52 days. When we have that type of work ethic and that type of humility and that type of unity, we can do incredible things together. Also, this book is a great book on overcoming discouragement and persecution. When you look at all the things, and you can go through and study some of these things, when Sanballat and Tobiah and some of these others, they heard about this, they got angry. They first started by questioning their work. They said, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Are you ever questioned about your faith? Questioned as, and you feel like it's not really an honest question, it's just meant to try and cause doubt. Nehemiah and the people faced that. Then they mocked the work. When they saw the people getting busy, they started taunting them and jeering at them. One of them even said, if a fox steps up on that wall, it's going to fall down. What he was saying is, what you're going to build is going to be so weak, it's pointless. Do people mock you for your faith? Do people jeer at your faith? Do people try and make you feel like your faith is meaningless? Happened to Nehemiah. They tried to persecute the work. They actually made a plan to attack the people. The only reason they didn't is they found out that Nehemiah knew and he was prepared. But you know, those people, that took some courage. They didn't know that Sanballat and Tobiah and the others would back down. For all they knew, at any moment, there were soldiers getting ready to come for them while they were working to attack them and beat them and maybe kill them. But they kept on working. We don't face that type of persecution right now. But if we were to face persecution, when we face other forms of persecution, do we show the courage of Nehemiah and the Israelites? They tried to kill Nehemiah. They tried to set a trap for Nehemiah, but he didn't fall for it. When they couldn't just kill Nehemiah, they tried other means. They tried to defame him. But Nehemiah had lived a good life, and it wouldn't stick. They tried to trap him. They had a man pretend to be a prophet and tell him to go to the temple to do something. And Nehemiah said, I can't go in the temple. I'm not allowed inside the temple. What were they trying to do? They were trying to get him trapped. They were trying to get dirt on him so that they could defame him. But he didn't fall for it. We will face all of these types of things. Maybe not people literally trying to kill us. Maybe so. But we will face persecution. The book of Nehemiah is a great help and encouragement in overcoming that. I've already alluded to this a little bit, but this is a great book on prayer. There are so many prayers throughout this book. Some of them are recorded at length, like chapter 1, verse 5 through 11, Nehemiah's prayer. Chapter 9, the public prayer of confession of the people. Sometimes it's just a little allusion, like the one we're told about in 2 verse 4, when he just says, I said a prayer to God. We don't know exactly what he said. It was a quick one. But what we do learn is prayer was important to Nehemiah. After some of the trials that come, when Sanballat and Tobiah begin to taunt, what does Nehemiah do? Instead of retaliating, he prays to God about it. He prays about his enemies in chapter 6 and in verse 13 with some of the failures that happened. And three of the ones that are interesting are that remembrance in 5 verse 19 and 13 verse 14 and 13 verse 31. They might sound conceited because what Nehemiah prays is he prays multiple times throughout the book, Lord, remember the good that I have done. And I don't think this is Nehemiah praying to God, look, I've been really good, you owe me this. But Nehemiah had lived the way that he lived. He had lived sacrificially. That chapter where he talked about the oppression and the exploitation, the way he countered that was by example. As a governor, he could have demanded a food allowance, and he never did. Instead, from his own expense, he fed others. And at the end of that, he prays that God would remember the good that he had done. Now, that's not him saying, you owe me this. But I think that is Nehemiah recognizing he is living a certain way, a sacrificial way, because he trusts in God. And that's what that prayer is about. Now, here's the thing. Nehemiah could back it up. Can we really pray that? If we were facing our final moments right now, could we utter the final words of this book? The way this book ends, the last line is the prayer of Nehemiah, remember me, O my God, for good. Have we lived in such a way that we can say, Lord, for all the failures, I have trusted in you. I have done my best to live in accordance to your word. I have tried to live the way you want me to. Please remember me for good. What a powerful thing. Hezekiah was able to do that. That's another story. What a powerful thing. Not in self-righteousness, not in haughtiness or arrogance, but because we really have lived a life trusting in the Lord, we can pray that way. And speaking of that, trusting in God is something throughout the book. I won't read all of these for time's sake, but again and again and again, for all of the work that they do, for all of the leadership, Nehemiah is used for leadership a lot, and I really haven't even touched on that. But for all of those other subjects, it always comes back to God. This is God working, God empowering. It's faithfulness to God that allows the people to do this. This book teaches that when you want to overcome, when you want to succeed, we must place our trust in God. Now, that being said, it goes hand in hand. Trusting in God goes hand in hand with reading and studying and knowing and obeying God's word. The people didn't trust in God and do nothing. The people trusted in God and they listened to his word. They trusted in their God and they obeyed his word. They trusted in God and they got busy. It's not enough to just say, I trust in God, and then go live our life the way we want to. We must know his word. We can't possibly trust in God if we don't know what God has said and what he has spoken to us. So those are some of the main themes. One last thing that I want to mention before we close is I want to read this verse. This is during the confession in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 36. The people said, behold, we are slaves this day in the land that you gave to our fathers to enjoy its fruit and its good gifts. Behold, we are slaves, and its rich yield goes to the kings whom you have set over us because of our sins. They rule over our bodies and over our livestock as they please, and we are in great distress. I want you to think about those words. And remember those eras that we put up on one of our first slides. When are the people praying this? When they have returned from captivity to Jerusalem. This is very important right here. The people were back. The temple was rebuilt. The city walls had been completed. And they still had not fully been restored. And even for the joy that comes later, they still weren't. This was still true. Because they were still ruled by Persia. And when Persia fell, they would be ruled by Greece. And when Greece fell, they would be ruled by Rome. And from that time forward, there has never been a king to sit on the physical throne of Israel and rule them physically. They were still slaves. So all of those promises, the reason this is important is because up until this point, all those books of prophecy that we read about, they fall before this book, except for Malachi. And they promised something. They promised a return and a glorious restoration. And it hasn't happened in the book of Nehemiah. And it hasn't happened when the Old Testament closes. Why? Because those prophets, while there was a portion that was saying, yes, you will be returned to the land you came from, what they were really looking at was a spiritual restoration under the true king, under the Son of David, that is the Messiah and the Lord. That is Jesus. And so as joyous as they were that their temple was back, which by the way would also end up destroyed, as excited as they were that their city walls were built, which in AD 70 would be torn down and demolished by the Romans, they were not free. But we are. Because we do serve the King. Because we do serve the Lord, and it's King Jesus. And it's in Jesus that God's promises have found fulfillment. And if they were joyous in their situation, how much more should we rejoice? That despite whatever troubles and trials we face, we are free as citizens of the kingdom of God, the Son of David, that is Jesus the Christ, the Messiah and our Savior. We have what they longed for. Don't ever forget that. So learn from these books. But I wanted to end on that note because as interesting as it is to learn about the Old Testament, it's so much more important to learn how it points forward to Jesus and what that means for us. And so on that note, we'll draw our study to a conclusion.